On the 1st of September 1940, RAF Biggin Hill was again under Luftwaffe attack. The fighter station had already been hit repeatedly. 3 members of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, Joan Mortimer, Elspeth Henderson, and Helen Turner, were working on the communication system that linked the station to the wider air defense network. They stayed at their posts and kept vital signals moving while the station was being bombed. All 3 were later awarded the Military Medal. Their story contains a problem with the way Britain's air war is often remembered. The most famous image is still the fighter pilot climbing into a Hurricane or Spitfire and taking off to meet German aircraft. That image is true, but it begins very late in the process. Before a fighter could intercept anything, somebody had to detect the raid, turn separate reports into a usable picture, pass orders, keep an airfield functioning, maintain aircraft, build replacements, and move new machines from factories to operational units.
How much of that chain came to depend on women? If you enjoy British history told through the people and systems that made victory possible, please like the video and subscribe. The Women's Auxiliary Air Force had been created on the 28th of June 1939 and mobilized before war began. Its purpose was not to create a separate female air force. It was closely linked to the Royal Air Force and intended, where possible, to substitute women for RAF personnel needed elsewhere. At first, many jobs looked conventional: clerks, drivers, cooks, telephonists, and orderlies. But modern air warfare rapidly pushed women closer to the machinery that controlled it. That mattered because Fighter Command did not defend Britain by simply keeping squadrons waiting until somebody saw bombers overhead. Hugh Dowding's system connected radar stations, the observer corps, filter rooms, group headquarters, sector stations, telephone and teleprinter networks, controllers, and fighter squadrons. The value of a Hurricane in the air depended on information reaching it quickly enough to put it in the right place. Throughout 1940, WAAFs were already serving on frontline radar units, in Fighter Command Group and Sector Operations rooms, and inside the filter center at Bentley Priory. Some worked as radar operators, others were plotters or tellers. Reports arriving through the detection network had to be reconciled, updated, and displayed so controllers could understand where raids were moving and decide which squadrons to commit. In a sector operations room, WAAF plotters worked around the large map table, while officers used the changing picture to control the battle. Markers showed friendly and hostile aircraft. Their position, direction, and age mattered. Out-of-date information could send fighters toward empty sky. A confused picture could waste fuel and time. When aircraft and trained pilots were limited resources, information itself had operational value. This is the first part of the answer. Women were not simply near Fighter Command. They were inside the system that allowed Fighter Command to function, and the Luftwaffe was attacking that system. On the 1st of August 1940, Hitler's Directive No. 17 ordered the German Air Force to overcome the Royal Air Force and its supporting infrastructure. On the 12th of August, attacks struck radar stations and airfields as the Luftwaffe prepared for the main offensive. Later that month, pressure fell heavily on Fighter Command sector stations such as Biggin Hill. The women serving at those locations were officially outside combat aircrew, but that distinction offered little physical protection when the target was the station itself. The Biggin Hill Awards make that danger unusually visible. Mortimer, Henderson, and Turner were telecommunications operators. During heavy attacks at the end of August and beginning of September, they continued passing defense signals despite damage to the station. Mortimer also marked unexploded bombs after one attack so that others could identify the danger. Their military medals recognized specific conduct while an operational fighter station was being attacked. But communications and plotting were only one link. A fighter station was a working technical organization as much as a place from which pilots took off.
Aircraft had to be inspected and repaired. Vehicles had to move personnel and equipment. Weather information had to be produced. Telephones, wireless, and administration had to keep operating. As the war expanded, WAAF trades expanded with it. Women entered technical work that included aircraft maintenance and repair, meteorology, and communications. By the end of the war, the range of duties open to the service had grown enormously. This does not mean women suddenly performed every ground crew task. Male fitters, riggers, armourers, mechanics, and other specialists remained fundamental to Royal Air Force operations. The important point is that the RAF could no longer afford to treat huge areas of technical manpower as exclusively male. A woman operating radar did not shoot down a bomber. A telephonist did not fly an interception. A mechanic did not command a squadron. But if detection failed, if orders could not be passed, or if serviceable aircraft were unavailable, the fighter pilot's courage could not compensate for the missing link. That is why the phrase ground support can sometimes conceal more than it explains. In an integrated air defense system, many supposedly supporting functions were conditions that had to be met before combat was possible at all. We've reached halfway. If this changes the way you see Britain's air war, please like the video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which of these roles deserves more attention. There was another gap in the chain that became increasingly important as aircraft production rose. A new fighter leaving a factory was not automatically an operational fighter. It still had to reach the Royal Air Force. The Air Transport Auxiliary existed to help solve that problem. It was a civilian organisation, not part of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, and that distinction matters. Its pilots ferried aircraft from factories and maintenance organisations to Royal Air Force and Royal Navy units. The organisation made use of pilots who might not enter conventional military flying because of age, health, or sex. Women were admitted cautiously. Pauline Gower received authority to appoint an initial group of 8 female pilots based at Hatfield. When they were presented publicly in January 1940, they were restricted to basic trainers. The controversy was revealing. Experienced women could already fly, but there remained deep uncertainty over whether they should be trusted with Britain's operational military aircraft. War steadily weakened that restriction. By 1941, growing aircraft production increased the demand for ferry pilots. On the 19th of July, the barrier against women ferrying fighters was broken with the hurricane. Women subsequently ferried Spitfires and many other operational types. The progression did not stop with single-engined fighters. In September 1942, Lettice Curtis began training for 4-engined aircraft. She passed the necessary tests in February 1943. Joan Hughes followed, and by the end of the war, 11 women had been cleared to ferry heavy bombers. Across the conflict, 168 women served with the Air Transport Auxiliary. They were not flying combat missions, and turning them retrospectively into fighter aces would diminish rather than strengthen their real achievement. Their value was logistical. Every aircraft delivered by an Air Transport Auxiliary pilot was an aircraft moved through Britain's aviation system without requiring an operational squadron pilot to perform the same journey. The service connected British aircraft production with the organisations that actually needed the machines. And that exposes another weakness in the popular memory of the air war. The Spitfire is usually remembered at the moment of combat. Yet before combat came manufacturing, inspection, delivery, acceptance, maintenance, and control. Women could be found at several of those stages. Now follow the chain one step farther back. Before the Air Transport Auxiliary could deliver a Spitfire, somebody had to build it. The Luftwaffe understood that aircraft production was a military target. In September 1940, German raids struck the supermarine works at Woolston near Southampton. Aircraft factories elsewhere were also targeted as Germany attempted to damage Britain's capacity to replace losses. Women were increasingly part of the industrial system producing those replacements. As men entered the armed forces, British recruitment campaigns specifically called women into factories. The surviving government material is remarkably direct. The state needed female labour because wartime production could not rely on the pre-war workforce. At Castle Bromwich, one of the great wartime centres of Spitfire production, an official photograph taken on the 28th of September 1941 records Winston Churchill watching a female riveter working on a Spitfire. It is an unusually revealing image. Political leadership, mass production, a frontline fighter, and a woman physically helping to build it. The factory story was not glamorous. It was industrial labour performed under the pressure of enormous wartime demand. Nor were women the only workforce. British aircraft production depended on skilled men and women, engineers, inspectors, managers, repair organisations, and a large network of subcontractors. But bringing women into production gave Britain access to labour on a scale that could not have been obtained from men alone. During the Battle of Britain, British factories were already producing fighters in their hundreds each month. RAF. Historical studies have stressed that sustaining fighter command depended not merely on the pilots, but on new production and the civilian repair organisation returning damaged aircraft to service. The air battle therefore extended far beyond the airfields shown in newsreels. And now the separate stories begin to join. The woman riveting an aircraft in a factory and the air transport auxiliary pilot ferrying a completed machine belonged to different organisations. The WAAF mechanic or driver at an airfield had another role. The radar operator and operations room plotter worked elsewhere again. They did not experience the war in the same way, and they should not be collapsed into a sentimental image of women simply doing their bit. What connected them was function. Aircraft had to exist. They had to reach the Royal Air Force. They had to remain serviceable. Enemy raids had to be detected. Information had to be filtered and displayed. Orders had to reach squadrons. Airfields had to continue operating even when German aircraft attempted to disable them. Remove enough of those functions, and a collection of excellent fighters stops being an effective air defense system. That helps explain the extraordinary growth of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force. By July 1943, it had reached a peak strength of around 182,000. By 1945, approximately 250,000 women had served in more than 110 trades. By 1943, women from 40 exact nationalities were represented in the service. The expansion was not equality in the modern sense. WAAFs were not permitted to serve as combat aircrew. Their pay was also only 2/3 that of their Royal Air Force counterparts. The service continued to reflect the assumptions and restrictions of its era. Yet operational necessity repeatedly forced those assumptions to collide with reality. When fighter command needed radar operators, plotters and communications specialists, women were trained for the work. When the wider Royal Air Force needed women in technical and maintenance roles, those trades expanded. When the ferry system needed more pilots, women in the air transport auxiliary progressed from basic trainers to fighters and eventually four-engined bombers. The result is a different picture of British air power. The Battle of Britain was fought in the air, but its fighters were sustained and controlled by a vast network on the ground. The longer air war that followed made that network larger, more technical, and more demanding. Women were not merely standing beside the machinery. In many places, they were operating it. Return to Biggin Hill. When bombs hit the station, Joan Mortimer, Elspeth Henderson, and Helen Turner did not need to destroy a German aircraft personally to affect the battle. Their task was to keep information moving through a fighter station while that station was under attack. That was operationally important and dangerous enough for all three to receive the military medal.
The forgotten women who defied Hitler's air war did not belong to one unit and did not perform one dramatic act. Some watched radar equipment, some moved plots across operations room maps, some maintained aircraft or kept stations functioning, some ferried Hurricanes, Spitfires and bombers across Britain. Some built the aircraft before an operational pilot ever touched the controls. Their achievement was not that they replaced the few, it was that their stories reveal how much larger the struggle really was. Britain's air defence survived because pilots, ground crews, controllers, engineers, factory workers, civilian specialists and servicewomen kept an interlocking system functioning while Nazi Germany tried to break it. The famous fighters were the visible edge of that system. These women were among the people who made sure that edge could still fight. If you want more stories about the overlooked people who made British military history possible, subscribe, like the video, and share your view in the comments. Which part of Britain's air war system has been most forgotten?